When we study jihad, the most important thing to keep in mind is that jihad proceeds in stages, and there are three main stages that we could break down. Stage one applies when Muslims are completely outnumbered. If they can't hope to win a physical confrontation with unbelievers, Muslims are taught to proclaim a message of peace and tolerance. And chapter 109 of the Quran is a good passage to study in light of this. It commands Muslims that if someone disagrees with them, you say, to you be your religion and to me be my religion. Very peaceful. But that's only under those circumstances. When Muslims can fight, when they can fight unbelievers but aren't in a position to subjugate those unbelievers, here we have stage two. And in this case, Muslims are to engage in defensive jihad. They're allowed to fight, and they have to fight if they're being attacked or persecuted, or if people are making fun of Islam, something like that. Muslims are to fight, but the unbeliever has to do something. It has to be some sort of provocation. But that isn't the end of the story. There's also stage three, when Muslims are in the majority. They're commanded to fight offensive jihad. And the most important verse for Christians here would be chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran. It says, fight those who do not believe in Allah. And it specifically refers to Jews and Christians. It commands Muslims to violently subjugate us until we pay the jizya, until we pay tribute money to Muslims. So this offensive jihad stage is what is commonly denied by Muslims in the West, but it was certainly present. It's present in the Quran, it was present in the life of Muhammad, and it's been present in Islam for 14 centuries. And we're seeing the ramifications even today.
Therefore, when you meet the unbelievers, presumably in a battle, smite at their necks.
Yet, Islamic scholars like Professor Rashid Khalidi dispute that the Quran offers any justification for beheading. He cites the lines coming immediately after one of the two verses used to justify beheadings.
At length, when ye have thoroughly subdued them, bind the captives firmly, therefore is the time for either generosity or ransom. I've just read Surah 47, verse 4. If they've cut off their heads, you're not going to bind them. And you're not binding them to cut off their heads. You're binding them to either be generous with them, release them, or ransom them, hold them for ransom. So there's nothing about cutting off heads in this passage. The people who are doing this are claiming this passage as justification for this practice. It is not. It just shows that they don't know anything about Islam, and they probably don't know how to read this properly.
Wow, are we ever in trouble when we rely on quote-unquote scholars such as this? I mean, really, this is where our media and our so-called educational system and our pop culture gets its information. It's just mind-blowing. And he claims that ISIS doesn't know how to read the Quran. What did he just affirm? First of all, he affirmed that the Quran says that when you fight against unbelievers, do the following, okay? So first of all, the Quran affirms that Muslims are going to fight people because they are unbelievers. Second of all, it came right out of his mouth, smite them on the neck. Well, I wonder what that could possibly mean. And then he claims that he's going to be the one to provide you the greater context, don't you know? So that way you could understand it really well. Well, that's perfectly feasible. Of course you want to go beyond the one verse and check the greater context, which is what? Notice what he affirms. The Quran allows for the taking captive of unbelievers and holding them for ransom. That's perfectly acceptable, okay? We get that. Now in the info section, you'll see a link to an article I posted on this where I reviewed 6 different translations of the Quran. So that way you get your fill. Have it any way you want. It still says the same thing. And it's actually exactly what he reads here. Therefore, when you meet the unbelievers, and it's not presumably during war, it is, here's a few translations, in battle, in fight, jihad, in Allah's cause, in battle, in fight, in battle, okay? Smite at their neck. At length, when you have thoroughly subdued them, bind the captives firmly. Okay, so in other words, actually, you don't need other words. There are the words right there. You meet the unbeliever, you smite them on the neck. Then, at length, thereafter, when you have thoroughly subdued them, so first you behead them, then when you have subdued them, then you bind them. I mean, it's a protocol, which goes something like this, and I'll read from the Sahih International translation. And mind you, international means that they're trying to water it down for a general public. Here's what it says. Strike their neck until, when you have inflicted slaughter upon them, then secure their bonds, and either confer favor afterwards or ransom them until the war lays down its burdens. You hear all those qualifying terms about a protocol, step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on? That's what it is. It's right in front of his face. It's telling him that Muslims are to fight unbelievers, strike at their neck. Once they are winning, once they are subduing, once they get the heads up, at length, when you have thoroughly subdued them, then bind them, then hold them for ransom if you want. I mean, it's right there. He is literally reading it, but he's overlaying a denial of that which he's reading. And PBS is just falling for it. It's truly astonishing.
Therefore, when you meet the unbelievers, presumably in a battle, smite at their necks. At length, when ye have thoroughly subdued them, bind the captives firmly. Therefore is the time for either generosity or ransom. If they've cut off their heads, you're not going to bind them. And you're not binding them to cut off their heads. You're binding them to either be generous with them, release them, or ransom them. So there's nothing about cutting off heads in this passage. Smite at their necks. So there's nothing about cutting off heads in this passage. Smite at their necks. It just shows that they don't know anything about Islam, and they probably don't know how to read this properly. Smite at their necks. Smite at their necks. Smite at their necks.
In rapid succession, ISIS's recent beheadings of American journalists James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, and British aid worker David Haynes shocked and outraged the public and prompted an American military response.
If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven.
And now another British aid worker, Alan Henning, has suffered the same fate, a story that prompted another round of intense coverage. Despite the widespread coverage of the 4 recent ISIS beheadings, Dr. Don Perlmutter, an author and scholar who for years has studied ritualistic crimes and religious terrorism, says videotaped beheadings are nothing new, and that these recent events are actually just the tip of the iceberg. She told us just yesterday it would be safe to say there have been more than 24 beheadings around the world since the start of September. Among those, 4 people killed by Mexican drug cartels, 4 people by an extremist group in the Sinai Peninsula, and another person beheaded by Boko Haram militants who posted their own video just this past Friday. Few, if any, of those incidents even made the news in this country.
There's hundreds of them, hundreds of videos of easily accessible online for anyone to view. I get alerts on at least 4 or 5 beheadings a day in different parts of the world.
She says the beheadings that have occurred after ISIS fighters overran villages in northern and western Iraq and in Syria have taken violence to a level that even Al-Qaeda has chosen to distance itself from.
The one consistency in all of the formal beheadings of the different Al-Qaeda-linked groups has been that they have never formally beheaded a woman. What differs with ISIS is that they are beheading women and children and sticking their heads on pikes.
Why is the way you choose to kill someone, especially publicly, so important? Why beheadings of all the ways?
Beheading is the ultimate sign that you're in power. It is so organically, primally offensive and frightening that it's effective.
Perlmutter believes advances in cell phone technology have led to what she calls a beheading epidemic over the last 10 years. Hundreds of videos have been uploaded to the web by groups such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Iraq, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and those drug cartels in Mexico.
ISIS has taken that technology further because now we have Twitter, we have Instagram. It's sort of this unbelievable new phenomenon of primal warfare combined with modern technology.
In fact, beheadings in the form of punishment for crimes goes back centuries. It was common in the Greek and Roman empires. Henry VIII had both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard beheaded, and the French guillotine remained France's standard method of judicial execution until 1981. Even today, beheading as a form of punishment is still allowed in several countries, including Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Iran. Yet Saudi Arabia is the only country that actually continues to behead offenders. There were reportedly 80 public executions there last year, most of them beheadings.
As far as countries like Western countries, including the United States, who have expressed their horror over the executions by the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria, we haven't seen the same horror over just regular beheadings that take place in Saudi Arabia, several a month on average.
Adam Kugel is the Middle East researcher for Human Rights Watch based in Jordan. We spoke to him via Skype a few days ago.
When you talk to Saudi officials about this, they will usually tell you that their use of public beheadings is rooted in Islamic law and Islamic tradition. If Saudi Arabia were to try to, reform their practices on capital punishment, they would face considerable resistance, and they would be accused by this core constituency of, basically going back on their Islamic roots.
Some analysts say Muslim extremist groups like ISIS choose the act of beheading because they're also aligning themselves with what they think is an authentic Islam, pointing to Quranic passages they believe condone the act.
That's why they have to always have this reading of offenses, identifying, having the person confess, having the person in front of them, kneeling. It is an execution ritual.
Therefore, when you meet the unbelievers, presumably in a battle, smite at their necks.
Yet, Islamic scholars like Professor Rashid Khalidi dispute that the Quran offers any justification for beheading. He cites the lines coming immediately after one of the two verses used to justify beheadings.
At length, when ye have thoroughly subdued them, bind the captives firmly, therefore is the time for either generosity or ransom. I've just read Surah 47, verse 4. If they've cut off their heads, you're not going to bind them. And you're not binding them to cut off their heads. You're binding them to either be generous with them, release them, or ransom them, hold them for ransom. So there's nothing about cutting off heads in this passage. The people who are doing this are claiming this passage as justification for this practice. It is not. It just shows that they don't know anything about Islam, and they probably don't know how to read this properly.